Just a couple weeks ago, I was in Rome as a scholar in residence at the North American College. And toward the end of my sojourn, I had a great opportunity to go to the Vatican library. My friend Paul Murray is a Dominican spiritual writer. He has a good friend who works in the manuscript section of the Vatican library. And he said, you'll have an opportunity to see an autograph of St. Thomas Aquinas, which means a text with Thomas's own handwriting on it. So I was thrilled, and I said, yes, I want to see that. And I was expecting to see maybe one page, under glass. So we get there to the Vatican library, we're ushered into the manuscript room, and we're told to wait. And then in came Paul's friend, the curator, not with one page under glass, but with a dossier with about 80 pages, 80 pages, of the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is a text from the 1250s that Thomas wrote. So he was only a young man, maybe mid-30s when he wrote it. And there they were on vellum, which is treated sheepskin. And it was relatively hard to come by in the Middle Ages and to see so much of this, so many pages, covered in Thomas Aquinas' famous litera illegibilis, they call it, the unintelligible, illegible writing. Thomas wrote in a kind of shorthand. And so Paul Murray and I have both worked for years with Thomas's Latin text, in printed versions. Neither of us could make out one word. I was like, can you see one Latin word on here that you can make out? And the answer was no, because he wrote in this sort of strange shorthand. But what a thrill it was. And we were able to touch these pieces of writing, and we were able to hover right over them to see exactly where and how Thomas Aquinas wrote. Things that struck me, one was that there was a hole in one of the sheets, and the curator said, that hole was there in the Middle Ages. And I said, how do you know? And he said, well, look at the writing. And sure enough, the writing of Aquinas goes along and then goes up over the hole. So vellum, as I say, was hard to come by, and even a flawed piece, they worked with what they had. They were covered in his writing. There'd be columns of kind of formal writing, but then things scribbled in the margins and above and under. You also could see the hand of his secretary, Reginald Paperno, one of the only people in the world that could read Thomas's handwriting, because you'd see on some of the margins of some of the pages a much more intelligible hand, and that was Reginald's writing. On one of the pages, there was even a little doodle of the head of a horse, and it was pretty well done. Now, was it Thomas or just done at a later time? We don't know, but it just struck me as interesting. Imagine Thomas Aquinas doing a little drawing. It was a very moving experience for me to see these texts and to realize in the still very dark ink of these pages, there is the hard intellectual work of Thomas Aquinas on display. Now, I've seen a lot of beautiful things in Rome. I've seen the Sistine Chapel, I've seen the Pantheon, I've seen the Raphael stanza in the Vatican, I've seen the Caravaggio paintings. But I must say, honestly, for me, these pages of Thomas Aquinas were the most beautiful things that I've seen. It reminded me, of course, of what Thomas meant to me personally. So he's the reason, really, I'm a priest. The reason I'm a theologian, the reason I've gone into the work I've gone into was Thomas. And so to see this really relic of his work, of his person, was very moving. But what also struck me was how important Thomas Aquinas was and still is for the life of the church. Just you see in that cramped, intense writing of those pages, the hard thinking of Thomas Aquinas. We live in a time now where religion is often a matter of ad hominem attacks and of emotional responses driven up by anger and so on. To see this man, this genius, thinking his way so carefully through these issues, man, we need that today. Also, you think of Aquinas, who was so generous in his accessing of the intellectual tradition. Thomas, who listened to Jewish rabbis and to Arabic Islamic scholars, to pagan scientists, to Christian heretics. Thomas read everybody and brings them all into the great sort of symphony of his conversation. I think now when religious people often confront each other across these great divides, and look at each other with great suspicion. We need that generous-minded approach of Thomas Aquinas. I also was thinking, it's a tragedy that in the wake of Vatican II, not because of Vatican II, it's important to point that out, not because of Vatican II, but in the wake of Vatican II, Thomas fell into desuetude. Thomas was eclipsed in the years after Vatican II, though he was read very carefully prior to Vatican II. But I think the Church lost an awful lot when it set aside the deep balance and sanity and reasonability of Thomas Aquinas. I think when we pushed him to the side, lots of far more inadequate philosophies made their way in. Think of the influence of Marx and Hegel and lots of other things in the years after Vatican II that were far more inadequate for bearing the truth of revelation. And so one thing I'm really pleased about is that there's a great Thomas revival going on. There are a lot of young scholars right now who are doing very impressive work in recovering Thomas Aquinas. I say my own work in a minor key has been contributing to that too. And seeing those texts of the Master when I was in Rome and being able to touch them, and kind of commune with them in a very intense way was very moving and just reminded me again of the importance of this figure for the renewal of the life in the church today.